Let's talk today about the real, practical, important differences between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Now, I've been planning to do this for a while, but for whatever reason, over the weekend, I saw on Monday morning, I had a bunch of tweets saying, David, you are repeating the idea that Bernie and Warren are the same. Now, I have no idea where this came from. I've been super clear that Bernie and Warren are two different candidates from the beginning whose policy positions are different, whose political ideology is different. I've been talking about it for more than a year since whenever this topic first came up. So someone seems to be confused. But I have said that Bernie and Warren are the two most progressive candidates when it comes to the overall package of ideas in the context of 2019 politics and how we sort of evaluate the progressiveness of ideas. So let's get right into it. The biggest difference between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren is the origin of their political ideology and their general philosophical positioning. Now, I'm not going to focus as much on micro policy in this segment. I will mention some specific policies, but a lot of those micro policies, number one, can change. And number two, rarely do campaign promises become administration accomplishments in reality. It's not how politics works. Of course, we look at what a candidate says they want to do. It matters. But what really is at issue for me here with the Bernie versus Warren thing is the source and underpinnings of their political ideologies. It sounds theoretical, but yet it's practical, because the most stark difference today between Bernie and Warren is in the ideological area, although I will get to the policy differences. Bernie and Warren end up domestically very close on policy, although not the same. And on foreign policy, there are more differences, which we'll talk about. But Bernie Sanders has ended up where he is today on the political spectrum, being pulled from his 1960s, 1970s sort of hippie democratic socialist origins. Elizabeth Warren, on the other hand, has been pulled to the left over her lifetime from a much more moderate leaning, which included actually being a registered Republican for a lot of her life, particularly more moderate on economic policy. On the one hand, Bernie is more of a destroy the system to build it back up mentality, where Elizabeth Warren is more of a fix the problems we have and improve the system that's already in place by tweaking it. And that is a massive difference. That difference is way bigger than the difference on any micro policy issues. Now, on a lot of policies and issues, their immediate next step, if they were to be president, is the same, but not always. So let's talk about some more specifics. When it comes to reducing inequality, Elizabeth Warren has taken a much more micro approach, which doesn't mean it's less ambitious, but it is much more micro, which is let's put in a wealth tax with the broader infrastructure remaining as it is. Now, in terms of the number of dollars that Elizabeth Warren's proposed wealth tax would bring in towards reducing inequality, it is massive. It is significantly impactful. But the approach is very different. Bernie Sanders has talked about other ideas, including progressive taxation and a variety of other programs. But his approach is one where he positions the current systems as fundamentally wrong, where Elizabeth Warren doesn't so much consider the systems wrong. She feels the system is incorrectly configured. And to use like a computer analogy, she wants to change some of the settings of the system. Healthcare has been a topic of much discussion. And I admit it's not completely transparent where Elizabeth Warren exactly lands on the healthcare issue. But the way I'd characterize it is Elizabeth Warren is not as in favor of Medicare for all as the path forward as is Bernie Sanders. With Bernie, we know it's Medicare for all. He has a plan for Medicare for all. He has a plan for how to pay for Medicare for all. And that is his path. Elizabeth Warren, including in the last debate, has expressed support for Medicare for all. But it's very clear that she is much more malleable in terms of the range of solutions that she would accept. She said she supports different ways of getting to universal health care, which is very different than what Bernie Sanders says, which is Medicare for all is the way. Let's talk about foreign policy a little bit. And I'm still of the mindset that, much like in 2016, one of the primary criticisms that I could make of Bernie Sanders, bearing in mind that he's one of my top candidates, is that he has at least not expressed deep knowledge of a number of important foreign policy issues. Now, the critique of Elizabeth Warren is not drastically different when it comes to the depth of knowledge that has been expressed. Now, that being said, I have not heard much from Bernie about, for example, what should our relationship to China be? I know he's talked about it a little bit around the edges, but I've not seen in detail what the idea there should be. I've heard more from Elizabeth Warren on that issue, although her position is relatively status quo on our relationship with China. With foreign policy, it again is a difference of philosophical approach. Bernie Sanders is what has been sometimes called a democratic globalist when it comes to applying a lot of the same anti-authoritarian, egalitarian, inequality reducing ideas to our relationships with other countries. Elizabeth Warren exists in a much more moderate space when it comes to foreign policy, taking a sort of standard center-left approach on a lot of these foreign policy questions. Now, to be perfectly honest, I only find Elizabeth Warren's policy ideas moderately different from those of, for example, Barack Obama in a lot of areas. I think domestically there's a big space there between Warren and someone like Obama. But when it comes to foreign policy, I don't see Warren as nearly as much of a progressive as we would potentially like to see. Bernie has been much more vocal about his opposition to American support for the Saudi war in Yemen than Elizabeth Warren has. I'd want to hear from Elizabeth Warren more about her position on that. A major difference, Bernie voted against increasing the Pentagon's budget. Elizabeth Warren voted for it. That is a fundamental difference in terms of the view of how we should be managing this issue of the financial enabling of American foreign policy and interventionism. Bernie is much more active in talking about American foreign policy going back decades and how that relates to the decisions we have to make today than Elizabeth Warren has been. Bernie talks about the history of American foreign policy in a way Warren does not. And this is really important because to make good decisions today about American foreign policy, in order to avoid dropping us into the same problems that American foreign policy has caused in the past, you have to understand the history of American interventionism in foreign policy. Bernie has much more often talked about the destructive force of American interventionism around the world, of military power over the last 60 or 70 years by the United States and the effects that it has had globally. I've heard a lot less from Elizabeth Warren on that. Now, on domestic policy, I know that there are many differences we could talk about. Bernie has said ban for-profit prisons and end cash bail, for example. I looked and wasn't able to find Elizabeth Warren taking that position. And she may not be for those things, and these are not insignificant, but relative to their broader ideological differences, I don't know that that is where the focus should be in talking about the difference between these two. So what's our conclusion? Is Bernie more progressive on a number of issues? Absolutely. There's no question about it. They are not the same. Would Elizabeth Warren still be the most progressive president of the modern political era if she were to be president of the United States? Of course she would. While I would love to see a Bernie presidency, am I going to smear Elizabeth Warren as a tool of the establishment or as anything other than someone who would also be the most progressive president in the modern era? No, I'm not going to do that. And I will tell you that her origin story is less progressive than Bernie's. She's more moderate on some issues. And both of these folks would be the most progressive presidents of the modern political era, period. Now, what is not included here, and it is a different analysis, is how likely each of their respective policy positions are to be made a reality if they were to be president of the United States. And that's a topic for a different day. Tell me what I'm missing. Tell me where I'm going wrong. Tell me if I'm fundamentally misunderstanding the differences between these two candidates.